Hey everyone, thank you for listening. This is Iya Tetsunagi, your host and narrator. Before we begin, I'm going to touch on a few things, then I'll jump right into it. For one, shout out to David Adams, the author of this Creepypasta. Thank you for giving me the chance to read this. I really appreciate it. If you get a chance, please go down in the description. I will link his story there. So please go give him some likes too. Without him, this wouldn't be here. Another point here, if I mispronounce some things or stutter, I'm terribly sorry, but I'm going to try my best. And lastly, this is going to be my first long pasta, so stay tuned for more. This is going to be a series, as he has parts 1 and 2 already written. With that said, please enjoy, and we hope you enjoy it. He wears a ragged black poncho with piercing black eyes, shrouded by his black hat coming down over his face, just enough to see the scar starting below his left eye, splitting down through his thick black beard. He bears a golden trimmed black vest, with a white dress shirt underneath, black dress pants with a worn leather belt, and a silver buckle with a crushed skull as its crest, alongside with slightly withered black leather boots, casually bouncing a broken gold pocket watch in his hand, whilst whistling his eerie tune through the cold windy night for all those unfortunate enough to hear. This is what my grandfather told me of the Whistler, or El Silbador for the Spanish-speaking readers that have been warned of this terrifying tale. He told me for my own safety and well-being, as he put it. My grandfather was never the most superstitious of people. He never claimed to have seen a UFO or that he had witnessed ghosts or any of the sort. He wasn't religious at all, really. He never cared for the Bible or going to church on a Sunday morning. My grandfather's father, my great-grandfather, Douglas Maine, was a Christian man through and through and led a very strict religious household when my granddad was growing up. He followed and obeyed the rules, but he didn't truly believe in any god or entities. That was until something happened to my grandfather that changed his life forever. One thing that he could not explain or debunk, though he wished more than anything that he could. This one thing that changed my grandfather's life for the worse was an entity of some sort that was full of enticing mystery and horror. He told me to heed his warning clearly. Beware of the Whistler, John. He exists with no doubt in my mind. He said these words while never breaking eye contact, and I could feel goosebumps run up my arm at the time. He will do everything in his power to entice you into a deal, as he puts it. He will offer you everything that your heart has ever desired, a deal that will satisfy the hunger of the greed within you. The way my grandfather described it made me wonder why you would want to avoid such an opportunity. I interrupted it and asked him that very thought that I had on my mind. He looked at me with such a serious face that I had never seen on him before and continued. Because when your end of the deal is due, the Whistler will drag you into the pits of his own hellish realm, a place that is said to resemble the dreams of 1,000 mad men. Your soul will be doomed for eternity, stuck in a horror of pain and suffering, all for a deal that at best will last you 4 decades of your life, and at worst, well, he paused for a second. The Whistler can decide the worst. He let out a sigh and put his hand on my shoulder. I know that you are only 13, John, and I'm not trying to scare you, but you are getting older now, and I'm telling you this because I love you and don't want you to make the same mistakes that I have made. He paused for a minute, taking his arm off of my shoulder and letting it fall to his side. I know that the Whistler is real because I made a deal with him 38 years ago, back when I was 28. He paused for a minute, beginning to tear up before continuing. Your grandmother had cancer, John, and I was scared. I loved her and I didn't want to lose her. He stopped talking for a minute, brushing his arm and then letting out another sigh before finally continuing. Your mother was just a baby, and your uncle a toddler. I didn't know how I would cope on my own without the woman that completed my family. I knew that I would have to continue for the sake of your mother and your uncle, but I didn't want to lose your grandmother. She was and still is the love of my life. I would have done anything to save her. I never knew my grandmother. She died 37 years ago. I had always heard a lot about her through my grandfather, about how kind and gentle-hearted she was, and how she would have loved me unconditionally if she was still alive to see me today. My grandfather continued. I would take walks through the woods that were 100 meters from our old house night after night to try and clear my mind of everything that was going on. It felt like maybe it would help just to clear my mind in the open woods while hoping for a sign of good fortune to come. My grandfather had a slight chuckle in his voice as he continued. Hell, I would even pray to any kind of god out there to help my wife get better. I would ask for any sign and promise to devote my life to their religion if my prayers were answered with a miracle. I was that desperate. Then that's when I heard it. He looked right into my eyes. The whistling. Gods, it was an eerie whistle. I can still hear it in my head to this day. It was coming from the deep open woods that seemed to never end. Hundreds of the trees that were in front of me had their branches sway in opposite directions as if trying to flee from someone or something in the never-ending darkness approaching. It was horrifying yet strangely enticing and seductive all at the same time. I wanted to walk towards the sound of the whistling, but the fear in my body wouldn't allow me to move an inch. I could tell that my grandfather was being deadly serious about when saying this. And then, appearing from trembling trees, I saw him. My grandfather had fear in his eyes remembering seeing the whistler for the first time. After a long pause, he continued to talk. He was walking towards me, but he made no sound on the ground. No twig snapping and no leaves rustling. It was as if he wasn't there, like he was something otherworldly. The only sound I could hear was the whistle making its way towards me and the slight sound of his broken gold pocket watch that he was bouncing from his hand into the air. He stopped in his tracks and looked up at me just enough that I could see the soul, never-ending black in his pupil piercing right through my soul, just appearing from under the rim of his hat with a widening menacing grin on his face. A layer of sweat began to form on my grandfather's forehead as he was remembering his first encounter with the whistler. With a tremble in his voice, he continued his story. The whistler took a cigarette from behind his ear and grabbed a match that was tucked away in the trim of his hat. He lit the cigarette, taking a long draw. After letting the smoke exhale from his lungs, he said to me in a horrible, raspy voice, "Hello there, Gary. Gary Maine." In a casual tone, trying to imitate friendliness in his voice, but his eyes told a different story of his intentions. They showed the intent of a never-ending pain and suffering. They spoke 1,000 words of a doomed fate. "How do you know my name?" I said back to him with fear trembling in my voice. "Oh, I know a lot about you, Mr. Maine. I know all about your doubts and beliefs, about your fears and worries, distress and burdens, your thoughts on how you will be able to cope without your wife, Sarah, if and when her cancer takes her life." The whistler pauses for a minute to take a draw of his cigarette, continuing to bounce the pocket watch in his hand. "Well, what if I told you that I can make your wife better, Mr. Maine?" the whistler declared, before taking another long draw of his cigarette and continued. "All you need to do is sign here." He held out the broken pocket watch with his hand and yanked its chain off with the other, revealing a little golden needle in the chain's place. "All you have to do is prick your thumb on that needle there, Mr. Maine. I will deal with the rest." I contemplated it for a minute before asking him what I would have to give in return for a miracle like this to occur. He looked me right in the eyes with a wide grin on his face. "Well, Mr. Maine," the whistler began, "it's quite simple, really. I will cure your wife of her illness on the condition that when the time comes, your end of the bargain comes into play. Your soul will be mine." He took another draw of his cigarette and threw it on the ground, stepping on the ember, his grin growing larger across his face. "Come now, Mr. Maine. I know that you don't want to miss a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity like this," the whistler said in an enticing voice, holding the pocket watch out closer to me. The temptation of living a happy life was filling my head. I reached my hand out and placed my thumb on the needle, piercing through the skin on my thumb. Blood dripping from my hand and onto the pocket watch, he started to bounce the pocket watch in the air once again and then caught it mid-air when the clock facing towards me. It was now ticking. He looked at me with that same menacing grin. "I will be seeing you again, Mr. Maine. In the meantime, you and your wife may enjoy your health." He turned around to face towards the trees that had swayed in opposite directions as if in a state of terror from his presence, and began to whistle his eerie tune once again, vanishing into the seemingly never-ending black forest as the sound of his whistling faded into nothing. As my grandfather spoke, I felt disturbed at the story he was telling me. I had but one question on my mind. If the whistler made this deal with my granddad, then why is my grandmother dead? My grandfather looked at me. "I can tell by that look on your face you're wondering what happened to your grandmother," he said, with venom starting to show in his face. Well, John, the Whistler was right. Once I managed to gather up enough courage to move a muscle after the encounter, I ran home. It was late at night, your grandmother sleeping, and your mother and uncle, too. I got a drink of water and climbed to bed. When I woke up in the morning, I was ready to chalk it up to a bad dream, but that's when I saw your grandmother, he said with a little smile on his face. She was the healthiest looking I had seen her since she was given her diagnosis. I couldn't believe it. And neither could she. The doctors have said it is a miracle, darling. It's as if the cancer has died overnight. I was filled with joy, and so was she. Your grandmother and I had our life back, and happy times were to be ahead of us, or so we thought. He paused for a minute and cursed the Whistler's name. That bastard. That evil bastard, John. It was a year since the miracle had happened, and your grandmother looked as if she could climb mountains, but that's when it happened. My grandfather tried his best to hold back the tears, but he just couldn't. The subject matter and how it had happened was too much for him. I gave him a hug and told him it was going to be all right. After comforting him for a short while, he continued. Your grandmother's heart just failed. I still remember it like it was yesterday. She collapsed in the garden while watering flowers. I was in the kitchen and saw it all happen. My grandfather looked as if to be suffering from shell shock remembering the story. I ran out as fast as I could, screaming her name and falling down on my knees next to her, trying to desperately save her life with the little to none CPR skills that I had. And then, as if conjured out of thin air, the whistling started again, and he was there on the other side of the garden fence looking at me. The Whistler, I said. My grandfather gave me a slight nod and continued. He had that same evil grin painted across his face, holding the golden pocket watch by its chain. The pocket watch dangled and its ticks were ear-deafening, like a flashbang in my head. I fell to the ground holding my ear, screaming in agony. Each tick felt like another day off of my life, another moment stolen from my grasp, and then suddenly, it stopped. My grandfather shuddered and said, he was gone. Just like that, he was gone. It was 15 years ago that my grandfather told me the story of El Silbador. He went missing 5 years ago today. People started assuming that the stress of life without my grandmother was too much for him and that he eventually came to the conclusion to end the pain, which never made sense as his body was never found, or that he felt the only way to get away from his past demons was to leave the past completely behind and start somewhere completely new. But I knew that neither of those things were true. What he told me about the Whistler has always stuck with me, and I know that his fate has everything to do with that whistling monster. I'm 28 years old now, and I need to seek answers for what happened to my grandfather, and why the Whistler done to my grandmother what he had done. Was having my grandfather's soul bound for eternity not enough for him? None of it sat right with me, and I knew that if I didn't go seeking answers, none of it ever would. I've been traveling the woods across the country, praying to all of the gods for answers and swearing to devote myself to the religion just like my grandfather did, in hopes that El Silbador will come to me. But for 2.5 years, I have come up empty-handed. I have been contemplating on whether the old age and heartbreak was beginning to take its toll on my grandfather's mind, and if the Whistler really existed or if it was just a delusion my grandfather had conjured in his head to direct all of his hate for his tragedy in life onto one thing. I found myself pondering all of these things on my mind on my walk back from the woods towards my car in my latest failed search of the Whistler. I was ready for giving up my search altogether. I reached my car and unlocked the door, sitting down in the driver's seat, and then I smelled the air. Now, I have never been a smoker, and I would never allow anyone in my car to smoke, but I swear, the air was pungent with cigarette smoke. As I found myself in awe, pondering the possibilities of the source of the cigarette smoke, I heard an eerie noise that sent goosebumps running up my arm. In the near woods in the distance from my car, there was the sound of an eerie tune being whistled through the cold and dark night. I ran out of my car as fast as I could, and just like that, it was gone. I ran back to my car with goosebumps running up my arms and jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. As creeped out as I was intrigued and dumbfounded. My grandfather was right all along, and this evil bastard really has brought great pain and suffering to my family. I was now determined that I would come face to face with the Whistler. On the drive home that night, I found myself completely on edge, unnerved and creeped out like I had never been before, trying to focus on reaching the safety of my house. Yes, I had achieved what I had set out to do. I had found undoubtable proof of the Whistler, but this entity was dangerous and at the same time felt rather enticing. It had brought great pain and suffering on my family and left me on a wild goose chase for my grandfather, wasting away my youth to find peace for myself and my grandfather. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally found myself back on my home street. I drove into my driveway and parked my car. I got out of the car and walked up to my front door with keys in hand, unlocking it. Stepping in my home and locking the door behind me, I walked to the living room and sat down on the couch, before getting up to retrieve a bottle of malt whiskey that I had. After a good serving of halves, I fell asleep on my couch from being too drunk. At some point during the night, I was awoken by the burning in my stomach from the whiskey. After a while of lying there feeling rough, I made my way to the kitchen to get a drink of water to try and settle the burning sensation making its way down my chest and through my stomach. After downing a couple of glasses of water, I started to make my way from the kitchen. Suddenly, I could hear a sound coming from my living room window. Tap, tap, tap. 3 consecutive taps on the window. Tap, tap, tap. Another 3 consecutive taps. Unnerved and on edge, I slowly made my way to the living room, hoping not to find anything more than a bird or some sort of animal. But I did have self-defense running through the back of my mind. As I approached the living room, I took a look out the window. There was nothing there. Knock, knock, knock. 3 consecutive knocks came from the front door. At this point, I was freaking out. I got down on my stomach so I could not be seen from anything or anyone that may have been peering through the living room window. Knock, knock, knock. This time, 3 loud banging knocks came from the front door. I was sweating and panicking, fearing the worst, and then it stopped. I lay on the floor for what felt like hours, before finally feeling confident enough to get back on my feet, believing that whatever was out there had left. Knock, knock, knock. 3 consecutive loud knocks came from the kitchen window, followed by it. That horrible, eerie whistle I had been warned about all those years ago. It was coming from the window, and I could feel my feet move towards the source of the sound, almost as if I were compelled to. Without hesitation, I grabbed a spare house key that I kept in one of my kitchen drawers and unlocked the back door in the kitchen, swinging it open. After what felt like hours of waiting, a man whose feet didn't make a sound, as if he were otherworldly, found himself walking through the door. "Ah, Mr. Maine. How very nice of you to let me in," he said in a raspy voice, trying to imitate friendliness with a horrible menacing grin on his face. "Do you prefer Mr. Maine or John?" the whistler inquired, pulling out a cigarette from behind his ear and lighting it with a match tucked away behind the trim of his hat before proceeding to take a long draw. I was too frightened to answer him. "Very well, Mr. Maine. We should take a more formal approach then," the whistler said. "Now, I understand you have some questions about your grandfather. And why what happened to your grandmother, what happened?" He took another long draw of his cigarette before he continued. "Well, Mr. Maine, I think we can arrange a deal, and I think we both know what I seek in return for my end of the bargain, yes?" He grinned at me with a grin that spread from ear to ear, piercing through my soul with his blackened pupils. "Now, Mr. Maine, my proposal goes as such. I will allow you to see your grandfather again, and I will explain to you what happened to your grandmother all those years ago had to happen. All you have to do is sign here with your thumb." He dangled his broken gold pocket watch before me and yanked the chain off to reveal the golden needle. I had a horrible case of deja vu. For memories I had not lived, but rather my grandfather had lived. It was all too much, and to see it in front of my own eyes all of these years later was terrifying. I found myself compelled to prick the skin of my thumb over the needle, blood dripping through my fingers and down the pocket watch. The whistler began to bounce the pocket watch in the air, before catching it with his right hand midair, facing the clock face towards me. Just like my grandfather said, the clock was ticking. The whistler took one last draw of his cigarette before throwing it to the ground and stepping on it with his old withered boot. "I can grant you one of the promises of the deal today. The other will come with time, Mr. Maine." I looked at the entity confused. "What do you mean by that?" I asked. The whistler smiled. "It will all make sense in time, Mr. Maine. Now, you have been searching for the truth on why what happened to your grandmother happened, and to tell you honestly, it was fate." His smile widened. "She was meant to die from her illness, and death is something that no human being may cheat. I cured her cancer, but death still needs its promises kept." He bounced the pocket watch in his hand and began to laugh. "If I can take someone's soul in the process, however, Mr. Maine, then I'm afraid I am a betting man, and I always play my cards wisely." He stopped to put the watch in his vest pocket and said, "Enjoy what is left of your life ahead, Mr. Maine. I shall be seeing you again." Just like that, he turned to take his leave, whistling as he silently walked through the dark night, vanishing into nothing, taking his eerie tune with him. That was a year ago now. I've been living in fear ever since. I guess he wasn't completely deceitful. Sooner or later, I will see my grandfather again. As I write this now, I can hear the whistler's eerie tune through the cold, windy night. He is tapping on the downstairs window and banging on my front door. I can feel that this is my end. My name is John Maine, and this is my final warning. Beware of the whistler.